This is how to loom knit a cabled hooded cowl. This is an advanced pattern, and we're mostly doing a 2 crossover cabling rather than 4, but it's the change up in the visor and the neck and connecting things which makes it an advanced pattern. You'll need a 41 peg loom. And what I've done is I've already completed the first shoulder panel, and I've done it flat on a 41 peg loom. And you'll want to make 2 shoulder panels, so that's the first one and here's the second one. And what you're going to go ahead and do is do an E-wrap cast on, E-wrap the first row, and then do 4 rows of a purl, and then go ahead and do a row following the written pattern. Go ahead and do a row of the E-wraps and everything, but you're going to count over 10 pegs and place a marker. And then you're going to skip a peg and place a marker on the next 2. Then you're going to skip another peg and do a marker on the next 2, which is another cabled area. Skip the next one and mark the next 3, but overlap the middle one because this is going to be your braid cable. So there's that one, then skip one and then do another 3 marker, marking the middle one twice. Skip, mark the next 2 as another cable section. Skip, mark the next 2, skip, mark the next one, and then you'll go all the way back to 10 spaces. I have not worked this for a 40 peg loom. If you want to do this on a 40 peg loom, I would suggest that you go in and try to figure out where you can remove and add to make this work. Now, these big sections are your E-wrap, and then the first sections on either side after your big E-wrap section is a regular E-wrap, then the second one is a cabling, and then the 3 markers are your braids. And that's how you keep up, and every in-between peg is purl. So that's the best way to keep up with what you're doing, is the markers tell you. And so you'll know that the big sections are always E-wrapped, and then you can follow it down. So what you're doing after you do the first section, you start decreasing, you'll keep in mind that you're only decreasing to this section right here. But we're going to do a 4-row set, and so this is going to be our first row of our 4-row pattern that we're going to do. And the only thing that's going to change when you start decreasing is that section we just completed. This is a section that doesn't change no matter after you decrease. So purl the first one, then E-wrap 2, then purl, and now you're going to do a 2 peg left cable cross. So you skip the first peg and you pick up the loop on the second peg. Then you go and you pick up the loop on the first peg. And you place that first loop on the second peg. And when you're doing this the first time, it might give you a little trouble, but once you get the hang of it, this goes a lot faster. So place loop 1 on peg 2 and loop 2 on peg 1, and this is a 2 peg left cable cross. After you do that, you're going to E-wrap those 2 pegs. So you're going to E-wrap. And that is a 2 peg left cable cross. Purl the next one, and we're going to do another 2 peg left cable cross. So skip the first peg, pick up the second loop. So go ahead and pick up the second loop. We'll do this in slow motion. And then you want to pick up the first loop with your hook. And then you want to place the first loop on the second peg. First loop on the second peg. And then you'll want to place the second loop on the first peg. And this is an even slower version than the first one I showed. At this point, you'll want to E-wrap 2, then you'll want to E-wrap 1, so E-wrap 1, and then you'll notice that we have a marker for those 2 pegs. It's because we're going to work with those 2 pegs on the 3rd row. Purl 1, repeat the 2 peg left cable cross. So skip the first peg, pick up the second loop, and pick up the first loop. Place the first loop on the second peg and the second loop on the first peg. E-wrap 2, then E-wrap the extra. And again, on the 3rd row, we'll be working with the other marker set. Okay, so purl 1, and then you're going to do a right cable cross. So you're going to do a 2 peg right cable cross. So pick up the first loop, then pick up the second loop, and place it on the first peg. So place the second loop on the first peg, and then place the first loop onto the second peg. So the second loop onto the first peg, and the first loop onto the second peg, and that is a 2 peg right cable cross. And so you'll want to E-wrap those 2, purl 1, and then the 2 that always get E-wrapped, and purl 1. And this is the section that never changes. Now you're going to E-wrap back to starting point, and this is the first row of our 4-row pattern. Again, the only section that will change when you start to decrease, and you'll need to go to my blog link to get the pattern written out, going to be important to have that for this project. So now we're going to start the second row of our 4-row pattern. And what you're going to do is go ahead and E-wrap to that point. So E-wrap your 10. And I will give you a hint that the second and fourth row are the same. So go ahead and purl 1, E-wrap 2, purl 1, E-wrap 2, purl 1, E-wrap 3, purl 1, E-wrap 3, purl 1, E-wrap 2, purl 1, E-wrap 2, purl 1, and then E-wrap all the way back to your end. Now we're fixing to start our third row of our 4-row pattern. The first and third row have cabling in it. The second and fourth row are exactly the same, but it's best to show you the 4-row pattern complete. Also keep in mind, when you're going one direction, you will have cabling involved, and when you're going the other direction, you will not have cabling involved. So this is row 3 of our 4-row pattern. So your odd rows are your cable rows, and your even rows are your non-cable rows. So keep that in mind, just a little trick. So when we're going from right to left, we have cabling. When we're going from left to right, we don't. So keep that in mind. It's a little trick to keep in mind what you need to do. Alright, so this is a section that doesn't change, so go ahead and purl 1, E-wrap 2. Purl 1, E-wrap 2. Purl 1, E-wrap 1. Then you're going to do a 2-peg right cable cross. So you want to pick up loop 1, then you want to pick up loop 2, and place loop 2 on 2-peg 1. Then you want to place loop 1 onto peg 2. That is a right cable cross. E-wrap, then purl 1, E-wrap 1, then do a 2-peg right cable cross, lift up the first loop and put it onto the hook. We'll slow this down. Then lift up the second loop and put it on the hook. Place the second loop on peg 1, and then place the first loop on peg 2. So there is your right cable cross. And go ahead and E-wrap. This is the only time in the video that I slow that down so that you can see what I'm doing. At that point, I'm trusting that you will know how to do a left and right cable cross. I also show it going backwards because we will be doing the cabling backwards at one point. So you've just done a purl 1, E-wrap 2, purl 1, E-wrap 2, and purl 1. And then E-wrap back to your starting point. Now we're going to start on our 4th row of our 4-row pattern. And because we're on our even row, we remember that we don't have any cabling that we're doing on this row. Let's go ahead and E-wrap 10. The only section that'll change up when you start decreasing. Again, go to the blog for the pattern written out. Okay, this section doesn't change. Purl 1, E-wrap 2, purl 1, E-wrap 2, purl 1, E-wrap 3, purl 1, E-wrap 3, purl 1, E-wrap 2, purl 1, E-wrap 2, purl 1, and then finish the row out with an E-wrap. Now we've completed our 4-row pattern. You're going to do this one and a half more times straight like this, and then you'll start a decrease. So you'll do it one more full time. Then you'll do the first 2 rows as normal. Then you're going to start decreasing. So go ahead and you'll see here that where you start decreasing to create that shoulder, and then you'll see the straight section, and then you'll see where it goes to curve to the neck. So you want to go ahead and make both panels, and then we will start working the next neck area. So keep in mind, you start decreasing, you're working to get to half the loom empty, so that when we add the other half, we are completing the circle. So make sure when you're decreasing that you have it decreased down to half of what you have. So go ahead and pause the video to complete the shoulder sections, and then we will start working on the neck area. And in working on the neck area, I didn't realize the computer didn't take on the filming, so I'm going to have to kind of explain how to add the neck area. When you go to add the paneling, make sure that the right side is facing you, not facing in towards the loom, but facing you. And you'll want to overlap your first loop. So you'll want to take the first loop off of your stitch holder and overlap it on the last loop of the other side. And you'll want to place your markers and make sure that they line up with your cabling sections as well. And your overlapping loop should be on your right side, so that you will have 2 purls showing up on the left side. But you want to make sure that you have your markers for your cables. Now the best thing to keep in mind is every peg that is not marked is a purl. So we are going to start working circularly, and you want to mark your new starting point. So go ahead and E-wrap 2, purl 1, E-wrap 2, purl 1, E-wrap 3, purl 1, E-wrap 3, purl 1, E-wrap 2, purl 1, E-wrap 2, and don't forget, over here on the left side, you're going to purl 2. And then you're going to work the second half just like you did the first. So, E-wrap 2, purl 1, E-wrap 2, purl 1, E-wrap 3, purl 1, E-wrap 3, purl 1, E-wrap 2, purl 1, E-wrap 2, and purl 1. This is our first row that we've just completed of our 4-row set, our 4-row pattern, and we will be starting on our second row. Let's go ahead and purl that last one. Alright, now we're going to start our second row, 4-row pattern. So go ahead and toss first 2 loops over, E-wrap the first 2, then you're going to purl the next one, then you're going to do a 2-peg right cable cross, and we're going to be doing this backwards. So you're going to skip the first peg, pick up the second loop on the second peg, you can choose to do this the other way if you feel more comfortable. It doesn't bother me to switch things up, but it also gives you a chance to show if you need to go the other direction depending what hand you're comfortable with. This also shows you how to do this. So go ahead and place the first loop on peg 2 and the second loop on peg 1. Again, this shows you how to do the cabling from both directions depending on which hand you are. So go ahead and E-wrap the 2. That's your 2-peg right cable cross. Now go ahead and purl the next one. Then you're going to repeat that 2-peg right cable cross. So remember, skip the first one, pick up the second loop, then pick up the first loop, place the first loop on the second peg, and place the second loop on the first peg. E-wrap 2, then E-wrap 1. Purl 1, and then repeat the 2-peg right cable cross, skip the first one, lift the second loop, lift the first loop, place the first loop onto the second peg, place the second loop onto the first peg. E-wrap those, and then E-wrap the third one for that. So E-wrap 1. There you go. Then you're going to purl 1. Then you're going to do a left cable cross. And so what you're going to do is you're going to pick up the first loop, then pick up the second loop. So, you're going to pick up the first loop, and you're going to pick up the second loop, then you're going to place loop 2 that you've just picked up onto peg 1, and then you're going to place loop 1 onto peg 2. Now, I use my hook to hold, but you can use an actual stitch holder if you want to do this, if you feel more comfortable. I'm comfortable doing it this way, but if you feel more comfortable, use a stitch holder. That's 2 peg left cable cross. Purl 1, E-wrap 2, purl 1, purl 2. And keep that in mind. Then we're going to repeat like we just did on the first half on the second half. E-wrap 2, purl 1, 2 peg right cable cross, skip the first one, pick up the second one, then pick up the first loop. Take the first loop, put it on the second peg, take the second loop, put it on the first peg. E-wrap twice. Purl 1. Then do a 2 peg right cable cross, skip the first loop, pick up the second loop, then pick up the first loop, place the first loop onto peg 2, then place the second loop onto peg 1. E-wrap, and then E-wrap 1. So you E-wrap those, then you E-wrap the 1, then you purl, then you do another 2 peg right cable cross, skip the first one, lift up the second loop, then lift up the first loop, place the first loop onto the second peg, place the second loop onto the first peg, E-wrap, and then do 1 E-wrap. There's your 1 E-wrap. Okay. Now we're going to do a purl 1, and then we're going to do a 2 peg left cable cross. So pick up the first loop, pick up the second loop, place the second loop on the first peg, and then place the first loop on the second peg. So go ahead and E-wrap. And purl, and E-wrap, and then purl. You've just completed your second row of a 4-row pattern. Now we're going to start our third row. Keep in mind on this set that our first and third rows are exactly the same. So E-wrap 2, purl 1, E-wrap 2, purl 1, E-wrap 3, purl 1, E-wrap 3, purl 1, E-wrap 2, purl 1, E-wrap 2, purl 2. Don't forget to purl your 2 here, which can be easy. Remember, every single loop, every single peg that does not have a marker is a purl. E-wrap 2, purl 1. We're repeating the exact same thing we just did on the first half. E-wrap 2, purl 1. Now, if you do have a 40 peg loom and you really want to try to figure it out, my suggestion is to remove one of the end E-wraps originally and add an extra E-wrap in between your an extra purl between your braided cables. So instead of it being a single purl, make it a double purl between your braided cables. And that should about adjust it for the most part. Now we're going to do the 4th row of our 4-row pattern. So go ahead and E-wrap 2, purl 1, E-wrap 2, purl 1, E-wrap 1, then do a 2 peg left cable cross. And what we're going to do is you're going to pick up that first loop and pick up the second loop, place the second loop on the first peg, then place the first loop on the second peg. E-wrap 2. Purl 1, E-wrap 1, take the first loop off, then the second loop to do our 2 peg left cable cross, place the second loop on the first peg, place the first loop on the second peg. E-wrap, purl, E-wrap, and don't forget to purl 2. When you get there, don't forget to purl those 2. Alright, E-wrap, repeating what we just did on the first half, purl, E-wrap, purl, E-wrap 3, well actually E-wrap 1, then 2 peg left cable cross, 2 peg left cable cross, pick up the first loop, pick up the second loop, place the second loop on the first peg and the first loop on the second peg. Then E-wrap. Purl 1, E-wrap 1, 2 peg left cable cross, pick up the first loop on the first peg, pick up the second loop on the second peg, place the second loop on the first peg and the first loop on the second peg. E-wrap 2. And purl 1, E-wrap 2, purl 1, E-wrap 2, and then purl 1. And you'll want to do that 3 more times. Do that 4-row pattern 3 more times to complete your neck area. So go ahead and pause the video and complete your neck area, and then we'll start opening up the face. Now we're going to start working on opening up the face area, and this is what you should have so far. Both shoulders. And then you should have your neck area. Now we're going to start opening the face, and then we'll be working flat. So continuing on the direction that we were going, we're going to do our first row. It's going to be circular, so we're going to go ahead and E-wrap 2, and because this is fixing to be our face area, we're going to purl 7. So go ahead and purl 7, and don't take your markers like I did. I don't know why I did that, because you're going to need them to guide you after you do the visor. So go ahead and keep your markers. Don't take them off like I did. Just makes no sense why I did that. So just ignore me taking the markers off. Yeah. So go ahead and then purl those 7 while not taking your markers off. Ha ha ha. Okay, now that you've reached the middle section, I'm going to show you what to do. We're doing a decrease. And what I wanted to do to make it smoother decrease, I'm going to purl it, pick the loop up, put it on the next peg. And then I toss the bottom loop over. Then I purl 6 pegs. While not taking my markers off. Yeah. So go ahead and purl 6 pegs. You should now have 40 pegs that we'll be working with. So you just opened your face up. Again, don't take your markers off. You'll need them later. Okay, after you've purled 6, you've now this is going to be your face area. So, you now want to E-wrap 2, purl 2, don't forget to purl 2, remember it still works the same on the roundabout. Alright, E-wrap 2. And we're still lining up our cabling on this side. So purl 1, E-wrap 2, purl 1. Now you may want to ask, purl 3, what size does this fit for? It is actually a one-size-fits-all. Go ahead and purl. It will fit a child, a toddler. It turns into a cape rather than a cowl. E-wrap 3. Purl 1, turns into a cape rather than a cowl. It will fit a man's head. It will fit a woman's head. So it's kind of a one size fits all. You don't have to adjust it. Purl 1, E-wrap 2, and purl 1. Now that we've got back to our starting point, we're going to go past it so that we can start working flat from the end section. So go ahead and E-wrap 2, purl 1, E-wrap 2, the end. There. You're going to E-wrap 6. So this 6 peg section on each side is a ribbed area around the face. So now we're going to be working flat, back and forth. So we're going to be doing our first row of a 4-row pattern. Everything's a 4-row pattern, so get used to this. So go ahead and purl 7 pegs. E-wrap 2, purl 1, E-wrap 2, purl 1, and do a left cable cross, and we're going to go back to the way we were doing it the first time in the video. So we're going to skip the first one, pick up the second loop, pick up the first loop, place the first loop on the second peg, and the second loop on the first peg. And that is our left cable cross. Go ahead and E-wrap those, toss the bottom loop over, purl 1, E-wrap 1, then right cable cross, so go ahead and pick up the first, and pick up the second loop, place the second loop on the first peg, and place the first loop on the second peg. E-wrap those two. Purl 1, E-wrap 1, 2 peg right cable cross, pick the first loop up, then the second, place the second loop on the first peg, and the first loop on the second peg. E-wrap. Then purl 1, then 2 peg right cable cross, pick the first loop up, pick the second loop up, place the second loop on the first peg, and the first loop on the second peg. E-wrap 2. Purl 1, E-wrap 2, purl 2, remember to purl 2 through here, E-wrap 2, purl 1, and then E-wrap 6 to the end. And we've just completed our first row of our 4-row pattern, our new 4-row pattern. And we'll be starting on the second row of our new 4-row pattern. So what we're going to do is start our second row, and we're going to purl 7. So second row of our 4-row pattern, we're going to purl 7. Also, if you're choosing to do a 40 peg loom, you can, instead of doing the decrease by 1, you can just start working flat, I think, if you wanted to try that. E-wrap 2, purl 1, purl 2, there you go, E-wrap 2, purl 1, E-wrap 2. Also, something to keep in mind, your second and fourth row are exactly the same. wrap 3. And on the left to right rows, you are working the rows straight, no cabling, and on the right to left, you are cabling. Keep that in mind. You wrap 3, purl 1, you wrap 2, purl 1, you wrap 2, purl 1, you wrap 6 to the end. There we go. E-wrap 6 to the end. And we've just completed our second row of our 4-row pattern. Now we're going to start on our third row of our 4-row pattern. And we're going to start off by purling 7 pegs. So purl 7. E-wrap 2, purl 1, E-wrap 2, purl 1, E-wrap 2, purl 1, 2 peg left cable cross. So skip the first peg, pick up the second loop, and pick up the first loop, place the first loop on the second peg, and the second loop on the first peg. E-wrap 2, then E-wrap 1. So you'll E-wrap those 2, then you E-wrap 1. Purl 1, 2 peg left cable cross. Skip the first one, pick up the second loop, pick up the first loop. Place the first loop on the second peg and the second loop on the first peg. E-wrap, and then E-wrap 1. So E-wrap those 2. Then E-wrap the 1. There we go. And purl 1. E-wrap 2. Purl 1. E-wrap 2. Purl 2. Yeah, don't forget to purl your 2 right there. E-wrap 2. Purl 1. And E-wrap 6 to the end. Now we're fixing to start the last row of our 4-row pattern. So let's start our last row of our 4-row pattern, and you're going to start off by purling 7. Remember that your second and fourth row are exactly the same, and that you do not have to cable on your second and last row. Okay, E-wrap 2, purl 2, E-wrap 2, purl 1, E-wrap 2, purl 1, E-wrap 3, purl 1, E-wrap 3, purl 1, E-wrap 2, purl 1, E-wrap 2, purl 1, E-wrap 2, purl 1, and then you're going to E-wrap 2, the end. Okay, now you'll want to repeat this 4-row pattern 6 more times. So repeat it 6 more times, and then we will start working in the visor. So repeat this 4-row pattern 6 more times. Go ahead and pause the video to complete. Now we're fixing to work on our visor or our bill, and this can get complicated in here, so I'm going to show you the whole step. So this is kind of what you should have so far. A big nice open area that'll feel nice and comfortable and loose when you wear it. Okay, now we're going to take our end point and we're just going to continue straight forward. So go ahead and E-wrap 7, which means you're increasing by 1 and E-wrapping 6. Now you're going to wrap and turn the next peg, and you're going to purl 13. We're going to continue this ribbed area for the bottom half of the bill. So every time you're going from right to left, you're purling. Every time you go from left to right, you are E-wrapping. Keep that in mind when we're doing this, so that you know when you're going a certain direction, that is what you're doing. Right to left, purling. Left to right, E-wrapping. I'm sorry I went out of screen here. I do fix it. I'm just purling. When you start getting a lot of bulk, you start getting loom in unusual places. So I'm still purling. Okay, wrap and turn the next peg, and then E-wrap 12. Left to right, E-wrap, right to left, purl. So wrap and turn the next peg and purl 11. If you feel you've got the idea of what I'm doing here, you can go ahead and keep this wrap and turn concept all the way down to where you have 4 single loops in between the wrap and turn. And then then we'll go from there. If you want to go ahead and do that, that's what we're doing. But I'm going to show it all the way. Wrap and turn the next peg and E-wrap 10. Also, another thing to keep in mind, you're E-wrapping your evens, purling your odd number of pegs. Another thing to keep in mind, little tricks that help you know where you're at. Okay, now you want to wrap and turn the next peg, and you want to purl 9. I'd have to say the most complicated section is this section, the visor. You can make this simple. You can completely remove all this extra and just wrap and turn it down to 4 and wrap and turn, E-wrap 8. You can E-wrap the whole thing rather than do this purling and E-wrapping. You can E-wrap the whole bill if you want to feel more comfortable with that. You don't have to do it this way. I just wanted to continue the texture I had created. But again, you can just E-wrap this whole section, this whole visor section if you'd like. Or you can purl it. Wrap and turn the next peg and purl 7. But I would say that this is the hardest section here of the whole garment, and the only reason being is it's keeping up with where you're at and what you're doing. It's not that the actual technique is really hard, it's keeping up with where you're at and what you're doing. So again, if you don't want to do the cabling on the other half of this, you can just E-wrap the whole thing. Wrap and turn the next peg and E-wrap 6. Wrap and turn the next peg and purl 5. We're almost to our halfway point on our visor. Wrap and turn and E-wrap 4. Wrap and turn and purl 4. And we've completed, after this row, we've completed the first half of our visor. At this point, if you wanted to continue this technique, but then the other half you want to make it easy, again, you just don't do the cabling. You can just do it adding one wrap and turn peg in at a time with a straight E-wrap if you want. But I wanted to continue with my texture. So this is the first half of our visor, and now we're going to start working on the second half, and we're going to start working back on our pattern. This is where your markers that I removed but you kept on are going to help you. So go ahead and E-wrap 2, purl 1, E-wrap 2. Then E-wrap 2. Purl 1. E-wrap 3. Then E-wrap 3. Purl 1. And E-wrap 3. Here's where it gets fun. E-wrap 1. Then 2 peg right cable cross. Pick up your first loop, pick up your second loop, place your second loop on your first peg, and your first loop on your second peg. E-wrap. Purl 1. E-wrap 1. Right cable cross, pick up your first loop, pick up your second loop, place your second loop on your first peg, and your first loop on your second peg. E-wrap. And purl 1. Okay, now you want to purl 1, E-wrap 3, purl 1, E-wrap 3, purl 1. Now you want to purl 1, and do a 2 peg left cable cross. So skip the first one, pick up the second loop, and pick up the first loop, and place the first loop on the second peg, and the second loop on the first peg. E-wrap. Then E-wrap 1, purl 1, 2 peg left cable cross, skip the first one, pick up the second loop, and pick up the first loop. Place the first loop on the second peg, and the second loop on the first peg. E-wrap. Then E-wrap 1, and purl 1, and then E-wrap 1. Then E-wrap 1, purl 1, E-wrap 3, purl 1, E-wrap 3, purl 1, and E-wrap 1. E-wrap 1, purl 1, E-wrap 1, right cable cross, so pick the first loop up and the second loop up, place the second loop on the first loop, and the first loop on the second loop, on the second peg. Go ahead and E-wrap, purl, 1, 2 peg right cable cross, pick the first loop up, pick the second loop up, place the second loop on the first peg and the first loop on the second peg, and E-wrap. Purl, E-wrap 2. Then E-wrap 2, purl 1, E-wrap 3, purl 1, E-wrap 3, purl 1, E-wrap 2. Then E-wrap 2, purl 1, 2 peg left cable cross, so skip the first peg, pick up the second loop. Then pick up your first loop, place your first loop on the second peg, and your second loop on the first peg. Seems that this one wants to give me a hard time. E-wrap 2. Then E-wrap 1. Purl 1, 2 peg left cable cross, so skip the first one, pick up the second loop, then pick up the first loop, place the first loop on the second peg, and the second loop on the first peg. E-wrap, and then E-wrap 1. So E-wrap those two, and then E-wrap 1, then purl 1, E-wrap 2, and purl 1. Going back the other direction. So purl 1, E-wrap 2, purl 1, E-wrap 3, purl 1, E-wrap 3, purl 1, E-wrap 2, and purl 1. Now we're going to purl 1, then 2 peg left cable cross, skip the first one, pick up the second loop, pick up the first loop, and put the first loop on the second peg, and the second loop on the first peg, and your 2 peg left cable cross. E-wrap those two. Purl one. E-wrap one. 2-peg right cable cross. So pick up the first one, pick up the second loop, place the second loop on the first peg, and the first loop on the second peg. E-wrap. Purl one. E-wrap one. Right cable cross, so pick up the first loop, pick up the second loop, place the second loop on the first peg, and the first loop on the second peg. E-wrap. Purl one. Another right cable cross, pick up the first loop, and pick up the second loop, place the second loop on the first peg, and the first loop on the second peg. Go ahead and E-wrap. Then purl one, and there, you're done. Now you've just completed your visor, and you don't have to do this. You could sew it together later, but I'm going to put my original loops back on, and the way that I'm going to find my original loops is I'm going to find my original increase that I did, which is the middle one, and that's actually easy to find. So you just follow that down to where you find that loop and you place it on that center peg, and then you follow it from there. So follow that line. You see that that's the next one. I'm not actually picking up the literal original loop. I'm picking up the ones in between. This saves you a lot of hassle, and it doesn't look any different. So go ahead and pick up the next one and the next one, and do this on both sides all the way to there. And then you'll do the same thing on the other side. Follow that all the way over. To there. And then I'm going to go ahead and toss the bottom loops over the top. But there is your visor, and it's done. Now we're going to do our 4 rows. So go ahead and toss those bottom loops over the top, and that way you're going to mark your new starting point, and then we're going to work our next 4-row pattern. So mark your new starting point. We're going to do the first row of our 4-row pattern. This is the last 4-row pattern we're going to do. So here's what we're going to do. You're going to E-wrap 2. So this is our first row of our 4-row pattern. Purl 1. E-wrap 2. Purl 1. Going to do a left cable cross. So you're going to skip the first peg, pick up the second peg, pick up the first peg, and put the first peg on the second peg. Pick up the first loop, place it on the second peg, and the second loop on the first peg. Sorry, the air is a bit dry right now. Go ahead and purl 1. Okay, E-wrap 1, And you're going to do a right cable cross. So pick up your first loop and your second loop. Place your second loop on your first peg and your first loop on your second peg. Go ahead and E-wrap. Purl 1, E-wrap 1, another 2-peg right cable cross, so pick up your first loop and your second loop. Place your second loop on your first peg and your first loop on your second peg. E-wrap. Purl 1. Do another 2-peg right cable cross. Pick up your first loop. And pick up your second loop. Place your second loop on your first peg and your first loop on your second peg. E-wrap. Purl 1. E-wrap 2. Don't forget to purl those two right there. Purl those two. Then E-wrap 2. Purl 1. E-wrap 2. Purl 1. E-wrap 3. Purl 1. E-wrap 3. Purl 1. E-wrap 2. And purl 1. Now we're going to start the second row of our 4-row pattern, and keep in mind this will be the row you don't have to do a whole lot of cabling on except for the visor area. Purl, E-wrap 2, purl, E-wrap 3, purl, E-wrap 3, purl, E-wrap 2, purl, E-wrap 2, purl, 2. Then E-wrap 2, purl 1, E-wrap 2, purl 1, and you're going to do a 2-peg left cable cross. So skip your first loop, pick up your second loop, and pick up your first loop, place your first loop on the second peg and your second loop on the first peg. E-wrap. Then E-wrap 1. Then purl 1. And do a 2-peg left cable cross, so skip the first, pick up the second loop, then pick up the first loop, place the first loop on the second peg, and the second loop on the first peg. E-wrap. And E-wrap 1. Then purl 1. And E-wrap 2. And purl 1. Now we're going to start our third row of our 4-row pattern. Third row, 4-row pattern. And so you're going to E-wrap 2, purl 1, E-wrap 2, purl 1, E-wrap 2, purl 1, and then you're going to do a 2-peg left cable cross, so you're going to skip that first loop, pick up the second loop, and pick up the first loop, place the first loop on the second peg, and the second loop on the first peg. E-wrap the 3, so there's 1, 2, 3, purl 1, 2-peg left cable cross, so skip the first loop, pick up the second loop, and pick up the first loop, place the first loop on the second peg, and the second loop on the first peg. E-wrap the 3, 1, 2, 3, purl 1, E-wrap 2, purl 1, E-wrap 2, purl 2, forget that, purl 2 there. Then you're going to E-wrap 2, purl 1, E-wrap 2, purl 1, E-wrap 3, purl 1, E-wrap 3, purl 1, E-wrap 2, purl 1. Now we're going to do the last row of our 4-row pattern. So we're into the last row, and then we are getting close to done. So go ahead and E-wrap 2, purl 1, E-wrap 2, purl 1, You wrap 2, purl 1, you wrap 3, purl 1, you wrap 3, purl 1, you wrap 2, purl 1, you wrap 2, make sure you purl 2 here, and you wrap 2, purl 1, then do a left cable cross, so skip the first loop, pick up the second, and pick up the first, place the first loop on the second peg, then the second loop on the first peg. E-wrap. Then purl 1, E-wrap 1, do a 2 peg right cable cross, so pick up the first loop, pick up the second loop, place the second loop on the first peg, and the first loop on the second peg. E-wrap. Purl. E-wrap 1. 2 peg right cable cross, pick up the first loop, pick up the second loop, place the second loop on the first peg, and the first loop on the second peg. E-wrap. Purl 1, do another 2 peg right cable cross, pick up the first loop, and pick up the second loop, place the second loop on the first peg, and first loop on the second peg. E-wrap. And purl. Now we've just completed our 4-row set, and you're going to repeat this 4-row set 3 more times. You're going to repeat that 3 more times, and then you're going to decrease by every other one, toss the bottom loop over, and draw string cast off. After you do that, you're going to sew up your shoulders on both sides, and then you're done. That's all that's left to it. So go ahead and finish that up, and you're done. And this is what you should have, something that's nice and warm around the ears and neck, and something that'll keep wind, rain, and snow out of your eyes.